I'm going to go ahead and welcome our first speaker of the day, Dr. Kim Gorgens. She is a neuropsychologist and professor in the Graduate School of Professional Psychology at the University of Denver. So, in addition to working directly with patients, Kim has been committed throughout her career to addressing brain injuries through research and advocacy as well. She manages a really impressive set of research projects where she studies the impacts and characteristics of brain injuries, and she focuses on different populations, including athletes, people in the criminal justice system, and people experiencing homelessness. She also serves on state and national boards that oversee brain-related interventions and policies, and in 2011, she helped draft Colorado's major law around youth sports injuries as a former member of the Colorado Brain Injury Legislative Collaborative. And she's also currently the vice president of the American Board of Rehabilitation Psychology, among a lot of other leadership positions that she has. Kim is amazing at communicating her research, and her work has been featured nationally on NPR, on CNN with Anderson Cooper, US News, and in TEDx Talks. So there's a lot more that I could add about her background, but the final thing I'll say is I've had the pleasure of working with her remotely on a research project, so I can add that she's a wonderful mentor as well, and we're very lucky to have her here today. And she will be giving a talk about brain injuries in the criminal justice system. And again, if any of you guys have questions during her talk, just feel free to message them to me in the chat, or you can also just wait until the Q&A portion starts. So Kim, you can go ahead if you're ready.
Okay. First of all, Julia, oh my God, thank you for that. And it's hard to be a king in your own kingdom, so you can't brag about yourself, but I feel so lucky to have had Julia on our team remote. It's like the success story of students beaming in remotely for our research team. She's extraordinary. I mean, just a really seasoned, sophisticated policy thinker, even before starting the program. So I think she's going to change the world. Okay, so let me, you guys tell me, do you see PowerPoint?
Yep, that works.
Okay. How's that, good? Good, perfect. Julia, thank you. So I thought it might make sense for me to use my 30 minutes to talk a little bit about our research and then end with the policy implications, which I feel really proud of. And I'm really excited to tell you about those, especially. So I'm going to race through the content. I do a lot of training around the country. Talking about our TBI model, our Colorado TBI model can take anywhere from like a 2-week-long in-service to a 90-minute virtual package. I've not done something with so much detail inside of 30 minutes for this purpose. I obviously am okay to squish it into 10 minutes. So you can find the TED Talk is online and tells a little bit of this story, but because the audience, you are so heady and intellectual a group, I wanted to include also some of our research data. So we've got a round the world tour here, and we're just gonna start. And I'm hoping to have some minutes left over for questions. So apologies in advance for talking fast. I am originally from outside of Boston, so it comes kind of naturally to me to talk fast. Okay. So just to set the scene, the first question is, why would you screen for traumatic brain injury in criminal justice settings? And the answer is relatively straightforward, if not entirely believable. The reason is we're required to do that. The reality is no one actually screens for traumatic brain injury. So this was the 2006 Vera Institute report. The Vera Institute is an independent think tank. It may be very familiar to those of you with forensic interests. Every year they highlight an emerging problem in criminal justice settings and set the Department of Justice to task to address that problem. So in 2006, their report was You don't even know that you have this problem with the overrepresentation of brain injury history, but you need to know it. And their recommendations were that those settings routinely screen for brain injury and all of the comorbid conditions, and we'll talk more about that in just a minute, and that those sites provide education to all of the professionals working in those settings about how to manage brain injury. So now let's talk about how big a problem this is in terms of the incidence of brain injury and then the prevalence population wide. This is an area of research that has taken off in the last 10 years, but it's actually been an area of study for about 30 years. And our colleagues in Australia and New Zealand pioneered this, and I'll share some of their research with you in just a second. But you can see it kicked off here in the States in about 2010, and these are aggregate data. Some of these are our data too, and I'm going to share those with you. But in youth corrections, the rate is about half and half. So it's also half and half for young men and for young girls. You see the numbers much higher as you get into adulthood. So depending on the setting where you're evaluating brain injury history, it can get really high. So county jail settings, for example, are much higher. If you look at lifetime history of brain injury, you get that number to about 87%. I'm going to talk about significant brain injury history in just a minute, and like the importance of thinking about brain injury history not as a ubiquitous term that, well, everybody has a brain injury, so it can't be that problematic, but to talk about really clinically significant brain injuries. 36% of folks report that they had a brain injury in the previous year. So that number is pretty stunning. And when you look at the huge population of folks that we have under supervision in the criminal justice system here in the States, that number is more than 7 million. So in our research, our statewide number was about 55%. So 55% of our 7+ million people means that there's almost 4 million people with this cluster of really characteristic deficits that are more or less trapped in the system. We have the dubious distinction of incarcerating more people than any other industrialized country. That's a whole other conversation that we should have at a future conference. But this problem of overrepresentation of brain injury in criminal justice isn't unique to US. You see this emerge in France, where 31% of inmates have a brain injury history. Canada is really interesting. I've done a lot of training in Canadian criminal justice settings, and they have a really robust community corrections emphasis, much less volume of people who are truly incarcerated. And so they look at their data differently, but the rate of brain injury history is higher among folks who are in their corrective service. You see the same in the UK, and I mentioned that this research originated in Australia and New Zealand, really kicked it off. So why does brain injury matter? And I think I have one more slide. Well, I'm going to circle back to that point. I wanted to make a point about the risk for sustaining a brain injury while you're in jail. So why does it matter that you know someone has a brain injury? It's not just a headline. Certainly, we've had a lot of headlines about our research, but it's not enough to just know that someone has a brain injury history. You have to do something about it. So the first part of the picture is that folks with brain injury history have a harder time while they're incarcerated or while they're under criminal supervision. For example, this is some research from my good friend, Adam Piccolino, who's doing research in DOC in Minnesota. And he's tracked folks throughout super long-term sentences. I think his longitudinal data are 18 years old now. But he found that folks with brain injury history look different while they're incarcerated. So they use more correctional health services. They also get into more trouble. In some cases, they pose a risk to correctional personnel. Their risk for self-harm is much higher while they're incarcerated. So things like suicide risk, they spend more time on suicide watch, and their risk for recidivism is much higher after they're released. There's also, this is a really important point that I wanted to circle back and make. We think of jail as a relatively an insulated place, but it's actually incredibly dangerous. And maybe some of you had that idea already who've spent some time in jail or frankly watched popular media shows about jail and prison. The risk of sustaining a brain injury in jail is extraordinarily high. And this is a point about incidence that I wanted to make. This particular study is one of my favorites because the design is so elegant. This particular study looked at rates of brain injury in the correctional health service setting. So these are inmates who present to health services for an injury to the head. And their control group, this is the elegant part, was the community matched emergency room. So this is the New York City jail system. So famously includes Rikers Island, the census of which is much lower than it was at its peak, but it's still a really dangerous place. And it wouldn't make sense to have a university counseling center be the site for the control group. So they used data on the rate at which people presented for treatment for an injury to the head in the emergency rooms that were serving those same communities. So located alongside these NYC correctional settings. And the rate at which people were seen for brain injuries in prison was 50 times higher than the adjoining community emergency rooms. It outpaced any other setting, including Iraq and Afghanistan, in terms of the frequency of injury. So it's a really important consideration that a lot of folks whose injury history occurs while they're in jail face a whole host of other problems, not the least of which is that their recovery from the injury itself is complicated by the setting and the noise and everything else. Okay. The system can respond differently if we know something about someone's brain injury history and something about their cognition. So we're never going to advise a correctional officer or a probation officer to treat a brain injury. We're always going to be treating their presenting concern at what might be anger management or relapse prevention or parenting training. But what we know about their cognitive function means that we could deliver those services in a way that makes them more likely to be successful. So we know the successful outcome rates are really low in this population. So there's a chance we could do something different and do better by this group of persons. They're also eligible for some specialty services from state to state. So here in Colorado, our partners at the Brain Injury Alliance of Colorado offer community care coordination for folks with significant, used to be traumatic brain injury, now it's any brain injury history. And that person acts as kind of a central hub and resources, and I'll talk more about that in just a minute. So here's our Colorado TBI model. All of our partners, we started this over happy hour, like over beer, years ago. We're in year 8. We're closing out year 8. Actually, yeah, I think like mid-April will be when we start our 9th year. We've had terrific partnerships across the board. What's been special about our program is that we've had so many partners in the same sandbox. So partners that are notoriously difficult to get to collaborate with each other have been on board with making this project happen. So our model, this Colorado traumatic brain injury, now Colorado brain injury model, has 3 aims. And I won't go into so much detail, but certainly if anyone has questions about instruments or what's the neuropsychological screening battery, you would be totally my people if that was your question. But anyway, probably no one has that question, but we could circle back in more depth. But the 3 aims of our model, the first is screening. And this is not only screening for brain injury history, but also screening cognitive function. So this neuropsychological screening battery. The second is to make that referral to community care coordination. So we've called it alternately a warm handoff, which makes people snicker. We've also called it a reach in model, which people also snicker about. But this is a way that we can connect inmates or probationers with a care coordinator, a community-based care coordinator, before they leave supervision. So anyone who's worked in a criminal justice setting knows that when people are released from jail, for example, they get beamed into a spaceship, never to be seen again until they arrive back in jail. And it's really hard. They call it the catchment rate for services in the community is notoriously really low. So there's all kinds of reasons why people fail to make connections, but we're hoping to improve that connectivity by building a relationship with a person. We also have a third aim, which has been education and capacity building. Part of our education aim has been to educate from a self-advocacy perspective, our brain injury survivors, but also to train judges and police officers and correctional staff, behavioral health folks, so across the board, so that everybody knows exactly how to manage their own frustration and the unique needs of this particular inmate or probationer. Okay, now I'm going to spin through our data, but first, like, someone will have to wave at me to make sure you're all okay. Okay, all right, Dean, thank you, Dean. Dean, give me a thumbs up. Okay, so here are some of our Colorado data, and this is like the super high level snapshot. And then I'll talk about some data from a really interesting study that Julia was part of. So these are our overall statewide data, and these are some of our judicial partners there listed on the left. So we've screened about 4,600 inmates and probationers for brain injury history. Among those, you can see that 2,040 of them were positive. What I didn't say is significant brain injury history, and I'll just, because that seems an important point, I'll just like veer off to the side for a minute here. We use an instrument called the Ohio State University Traumatic Brain Injury Identification Method. And that is a structured clinical interview designed to yield a report of significant brain injury history in a population of folks who don't have medical records, which, spoiler, is literally everyone in criminal justice. So it walks people through and rules in and rules out injuries. So there are 3 scoring criteria that we use to signify significant brain injury history. So this is not your average, we call it, as a neuropsychologist, we call it an uncomplicated traumatic brain injury or an uncomplicated mild TBI, where the person recovers fully. These are the kinds of injuries that get people into trouble. So one is any moderate or severe injury. So these are injuries with a loss of consciousness of more than 30 minutes. We also have a first category, which are for folks who have a brain injury they sustained with a loss of consciousness before age 15, which is an age that shows up in the research as kind of a tipping point in terms of the vulnerability of a developing brain. And the third is multiple. So these are folks who have 3 or more injuries in a short period of time. So either before each has resolved or within a 2-month period of time. So you can imagine we flag a lot of women who've been exposed to interpersonal violence in that particular category, for example. So folks who have 3 or 4 injuries across a lifetime, they were mild, they very briefly got knocked out, those won't constitute significant brain injuries. So we want to pay attention to the kinds of injuries statistically that are related to poorer outcomes. So looking at these data, then with that in mind, that this is an all reported brain injuries, this is just the significant brain injuries, you can see that that percentage ranges on the low end from our juvenile setting. So this is juvenile probation, not juvenile or youth corrections, to a female offender program. This is a repeat female offender probation program where that rate was 97%. The N was a little smaller, that's 30 of 31. The overall rate for adults is 55%. If you include, we've got a little bubble of adolescent juvenile data from our Denver juvenile probation partners. And if you look across the board at all of our data, the overall percentage is 44%. Now let's talk a little bit about what gets really interesting about those data. So among the 2,000 plus people who screened positive, they were offered the chance to participate in a neuropsychological screening battery and to participate in research, which allowed us to code their data from their neuropsychological screening battery. So we had 974 people agree to do the secondary screening and to participate in the research. And in that population, there were more than 3,000 significant injuries. So if you average that out, it was more than 3 injuries per person, 3 significant injuries per person. What's really interesting in terms of mechanism of injury is that if you look at CDC data, really across the board, our number one mechanism of injury is falls. And as you look at the other mechanisms of injuries, you see that it's kind of a wash with motor vehicle accidents and like falling and striking your head. And assault, depending on the data set, these are CDC data, assault, interpersonal violence or violence related brain injury accounts for somewhere between 9 and 11% of all brain injuries in the general population. In the criminal justice setting, assault is the number one mechanism of injury. So that is more than 30%. So almost 35% of injuries are related to interpersonal violence. Note, a little sidebar, more than half of the injuries reported required hospitalization at the time. So these were significant injuries, not just getting your bell rung. This is a little bit hard to see, but it's one of my favorite slides because it paints a really rich clinical picture. These are the psychosocial vulnerabilities that are comorbid with brain injury. So here, for example, you see that of the folks in criminal justice who had a brain injury history, 95% of them also had a significant history of substance misuse, 76, and the little gray is the population base rate. 76% of that population had a significant history of mental illness. 100% of them had significant suicidal ideation, and almost 40%, 39.2% of them had at least one suicide attempt. Childhood history of trauma, 60%. History of being the victim of a violent crime as an adult was really close at 59.9. Academic failure, school suspension in particular was 62%. Expulsion was closer to 30%. When we look at our neuropsychological data, we see an even more complicated clinical picture emerge where 68% of them also have significant cognitive impairment. And if anyone is thinking with their behavioral health hat on and is wondering about like, oh, I wonder how many of them have comorbid substance abuse, mental illness, and brain injury, and frankly, criminal justice involvement, that number is 74%. So it's really pretty stunning. It's the riskiest clinical population from a management perspective. This is a study that one of my students did for their doc paper and published this, but a really important little point that I want to leave your audience with, which is there's something really unique and uniquely vulnerable about women who are in the criminal justice system. And there's a conversation we could have on feminist ideology and the overlap between victim and offender status for women in particular, which is outside the scope of my 30 minutes, but I'll just make a few points, which is that women were much more likely, so twice as likely to have any multiple brain injuries and 6 times more likely to have multiple violence-related brain injuries. So their rate of brain injury dwarfed men in that respect. The women who had multiple violence-related TBIs described themselves as sicker. They endorsed more health problems. They had longer total incarceration times. So not that they were incarcerated for longer, but longer time, which suggests more offenses. And they were more likely to have 2 or more violence-related injuries in close proximity. So when you look at those psychosocial vulnerabilities, those numbers are also much higher for women. We're writing that manuscript in real time right now. I make the point in my TED Talk that these women look like retired NFL players without the benefit of liability coverage or workers' comp or media attention and a lawsuit. So there's an incredibly vulnerable population of women who are re-entering communities who are set up in a lot of ways to fail, and the demands on them are really extensive. So parenting, job, sobriety, etc. This is the little study that is like a little carve out of our data that I feel really proud of. This is what Julia was helping us with our policy white paper and researching brain injury policy across the country. So we looked just at our probationer data and we mapped that onto official judicial record outcomes. So the question always is about recidivism, and it's like, oh, everyone's so obsessed with measuring recidivism. So we tried to do that, and it's difficult for all kinds of reasons. But I've just included some of our highlights here. This article is in press right now, but the control group was age and time and location matched folks who weren't identified as having a brain injury history. And the control group was either like 37,000 plus or 42,000, like depending on the setting. We had a huge data set. And what you see here is that folks that we confirmed to have a TBI history were significantly more likely to have a felony history, and significantly less likely to have misdemeanor convictions. Probation officers assess risk at the time of intake for folks who are coming into probation, and the TBI group was rated with more max risk, more medium risk, and fewer minimum risk assessments. And when we looked at those outcomes, not surprisingly, the folks with TBI were significantly less likely to complete probation, more likely to reoffend, and more likely to get back onto paper for administrative violations. So these are folks who on the violate probation are folks who fail to drop a urinalysis sample on time, or don't follow through with psychotherapy, or don't show up on time for their appointments. So as we put all those pieces together, there are these three components. So what we found really works is screening. So screening for brain injury history, and also, at least as importantly, is screening for cognitive function, because that's how you make really meaningful inmate or probationer management suggestions. We do have great materials. We've got a neuropsychological screening curriculum. We have a whole suite of self-report symptom checklists that we've designed, not as a replacement or a stand-in for cognitive screening, but in settings where that's not possible. And the third piece of our best practice Colorado brain injury model is self-advocacy. And here I want to tell a quick last story about my friend Markel Taylor. And every now and then in the course of your career, you'll get really lucky and meet someone who reminds you why the work you do is so important. So this is Markel. Markel is on the right here. This is the Denver district attorney, and Dr. Magazi, who heads up behavioral health. You can see that Markel leads with his story. So I'm not telling tales out of school, but Markel was assessed by one of my students at Denver County Jail during one of our pilot years. And he got screened as he was on his way into Department of Corrections. So jail is kind of two-way traffic. So he was on his way in after a conviction for burglary, aggravated burglary. And he credits this evaluation, the conversation with the student clinician, where she gave him tools to manage, in his case, being impulsive, with changing the course of his life. And Markel made it a point to, like, I'm going to get out of jail and I'm going to help as many people and have conversations about how important your brain is with everyone who'll listen. So Markel has built a whole empire of really interesting programming for returning citizens. So one of the really remarkable accomplishments that Markel has had is that they've built this peer advocacy organization. It's called the Rebuild Your Mind organization. They have the Rebuild Your Mind Challenge, which is a little like the Ice Bucket Challenge. This particular group, you can find, it's like rebuildyourmind.org, and their aim, it's staffed almost entirely by returning citizens and folks who are still serving time in DOC. So it's like literally the stakeholders. And their aim is to destigmatize brain injury, mental illness, trauma history, the kinds of things that people who are trapped in the system don't feel like they can talk about, right? It makes them vulnerable. So check out Rebuild Your Mind. It will like change your view on everything we're doing wrong in the criminal justice system. So Markel wrote a piece of legislation, and just as you might expect, right, it needed. It was like written so that we were going to screen and evaluate 9,700 people in Department of Corrections. And I was like, I'm working with Senator Coleman saying like, okay, that is not going to be possible unless you have like $50 million. So anyway, we changed the scope of it to fund screening and evaluation services in one DOC setting. So I'm hoping for Denver Women's Prison, and then to export that model one setting at a time across Department of Corrections in Colorado. And it passed, just recently passed the Senate Judiciary Committee unanimously. The chair of that committee said, I wouldn't have been able to tell you what I was waiting for, but I see now this is the piece of legislation I've been waiting to see for my whole career. And Markel and like 30 other people who'd been part of our program years and years ago. Obviously, I've never met them to a person, but they told the same story about how powerful it was to learn about how their brain works, the things they do well, the things they don't do as well. At least as importantly is what to do about it, right? To hand someone the tools to rebuild their own lives. And for these folks, they've just defined themselves as broken and useless. They're garbage and thrown away by society. They think of themselves as stupid. So when you reframe that for them, it can be extraordinarily powerful. Here are, this is Markel in the center, and two of his returning citizen friends who are also testifying. You can see that I'm here. The ding dong who missed the boat and didn't go in person and testified remotely. So here's our whole gang here. Here's Senator Coleman. You can see like Markel couldn't be more charismatic, but there's something really compelling about hearing someone tell their story about how a conversation about brain health made all the difference in giving them autonomy, agency, and ultimately mastery of his capacity to stay out of trouble. He's built a business. They have a marketing agency, ABOS Marketing, for anyone who's interested. It's if you have a chance to support a business run by returning citizens, it's the best money you'll spend, and have those conversations. That would be my take-home message, is to be willing to ask someone to be curious about their experience, because the effect is really pretty transformative. Done.
Thank you so much, Kim. That presentation was wonderful, and I think like obviously it's such a complex issue, and you always do such a great job of like making it very clear and communicating it very well. So I think right now we have time for one question. So let me see if anyone has sent me any, or if there's someone to call on right now. Kobe, do you want to go ahead?
Well, I guess I did have a question, but it starts with the clarification question first. During your talk, you talk about how there's higher rates of head injury in incarcerated individuals. And the clarification question is, I believe that you mentioned that there's actually higher rates of head injury for people that enter the system. Is that correct?
Yes, it's Kobe. It's both of those things. So if you just benchmark lifetime history of brain injury, that number, again, statewide in an adult population is 55%. 55% of Colorado inmates and probationers have a significant brain injury history. And that number is not unique to Colorado, right? That number ranges anywhere from 40 to 80, 90% in other states too. When you drill down, and this is what's so interesting about that 2017 study, is no one had previously looked at the incidence of brain injury in those settings. So not so much the history of it, but these are folks who go into jail, sentenced for whatever, and sustain their brain injury while they're there, which is a unique hazard that a lot of judges are thoughtful about, right? When they make recommendations for someone to serve a jail sentence, to recognize everything's made of cement and metal, and people are short-tempered and irritable, and it's hard to de-escalate conflict, and people get injured really easily.
Right. So I guess my question is there any neuropsychological theory about why people with brain injury have higher, like before entering the incarceration system, why is it that?
Yeah, Kobe, this is my favorite. This is that like totally messy clinical picture. And this is like the grossest term, like grossest as in like broadest brushstroke. I call it the soup. So there's very few cases where there's a direct cause-effect relationship between the injury and involvement in the criminal justice system. There are some studies out there that paint that picture. It appears that women have a unique vulnerability to that causal pathway. That said, what does happen is that people accumulate vulnerabilities. So for example, let's talk about a school kid who has ADHD. Kids with ADHD are much more likely to sustain a brain injury and then to develop substance use, and then their attention problems are worse. So they end up in this spiral. Kids who don't have ADHD who sustain a brain injury are 50 times more likely to be diagnosed with ADHD because of their attention impairments. And then they pick up substance abuse and academic failure and peer rejection. So it's like they accumulate all these vulnerabilities. It's mental illness, it's substance use, it's exposure to violence and trauma history. There's a lot of abusive relationships in there along the way. So it's like, if you think of it as like, people end up on this trajectory and they're picking up baggage along their trip that just weights them down and cements their status in the system on paper in whatever setting they may be.
Very interesting. Yeah. So I misunderstood. There's not a causal relationship, but of course it's going to be part of a bigger context. That makes a lot of sense.
Totally. And the important thing is, though, that the only one of those variables that is, well, that's not true, there's two, that truly is preventable is brain injury, right? So if you had people helmeted, if you reduce the incidence of child abuse, for example, if you reduce the incidence of interpersonal violence, you'd reduce the frequency of brain injuries occurring in the first place. The piece of the causal trajectory that's really important, obviously, as a neuropsychologist, is the cognitive deficit. So in our model, and this is what we're looking at in a population of women exposed to interpersonal violence now, is I think it's the cognitive deficits that are like the do not pass go that account for all of the trouble people have in the system. In this case, the women have in the system. So I think that's the mediating piece, but truly it's this like clinical mess that makes the work so hard, but so important, especially in the context of such a high self-harm risk.
Awesome. Fascinating work. Thank you so much for sharing with us.
Toby, thanks. I love the way you think about it. It's brilliant. If you're interested in tagging into our team, holler.
Definitely will do. So we're running a little short on time, so I'd love to transition, but thank you so much, Kim, for your presentation.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, guys. See you, Julia.
Bye. Great. So now transitioning on to our next speaker. So I know there's some undergrads in the audience that are thinking about their careers and wondering how they can get involved with TBI advocacy. So our next speaker is an undergraduate student who's gleaned some powerful insights into what makes for an effective national campaign. He also has some important ideas to begin the conversation about preventing head injuries in sports. He's a really great speaker and makes a very compelling argument. So without further ado, it's my great pleasure to introduce Gray Farley.
Thank you very much. Hi, everybody. My name is Gray Farley. I'm a sophomore here at Stanford. I'm going to share my screen real quick and I'll introduce myself a little more. But first of all, I want to say thank you to Kobe for inviting me to speak at this symposium and giving me the opportunity to share some research that I did last quarter. So like I said, I'm a sophomore. I'm studying engineering physics and computational science, which is a little separate from neuroscience and medicine, but I'm really interested in psychology and neuroscience. So I read about that stuff in my free time. And last quarter, in my writing and rhetoric class, we had the opportunity to create a research paper and a research presentation on a topic of our choosing. And I chose to do it on concussions and traumatic brain injuries, more specifically in youths, because I feel like it's a very compelling and very compelling topic and a really pressing issue today. So real quick, can I just get a thumbs up? Can you guys see my my presentation? Awesome. So I'll just get right into it. Concussion crisis. the rise of traumatic brain injury, and the failures of the CDC. What are concussions? Concussions are a common form of traumatic brain injury experienced by a large number of people every year, and that number is increasing. Concussion rates are on the rise. According to national health records, visits to the emergency room for traumatic brain injuries increased by over 60% between 2006 and 2014. Let's see, this image is taken from a study done by researchers at the University of Illinois studying traumatic brain injury. It displays data from an undisclosed United States healthcare network, which shows the increase in the number of concussions treated in network between 2014 and 2018. The data is extremely alarming for a few reasons. First of all, as you can see, there's a very sharp increase between 2014 and 2018 in the number of concussions being treated by this healthcare network. Second of all, a large portion of the concussions are being suffered by youths and young adults. You can see the data split up by age group, and the number of concussions, the increase in concussions is significantly weighted more towards younger patients. And finally, this data only addresses concussions that were treated in a doctor's office or a hospital. So it's very possible and actually very likely that the real numbers are more extreme. And so when I referenced some older studies on concussions, they actually indicated that around 100,000 high school students suffered concussions every year. However, in 2017, the CDC reported that about 2.5 million high school students experienced at least one concussion just in that year. So that's over 20 times the original estimate. This data is extremely concerning given the progression of research on concussions over the past few decades. So in the 80s and 90s, concussions were largely thought to be mostly mild injuries with mostly temporary effects. However, research really turned a corner in 2005 when research on former NFL players' brains led to the first diagnosis of chronic traumatic encephalopathy, or CTE. It's a bit of a tongue twister. CTE is a neurodegenerative disease caused by repeated trauma to the brain. And since this diagnosis in 2005, concussion research has progressed significantly. And research now indicates that concussions are very serious injuries that can cause long-term damage to both cognition and mental health. So what is being done to help remedy rising concussion rates? Well, in 2005, the CDC established its Heads Up program, which aims to improve concussion education and awareness in youth sports. So what the Heads Up program does is it gives educational courses and resources to youth athletic coaches, such as online training programs and pamphlets. And evidence actually shows that the Heads Up program is working. So it has been successful in increasing education among high school coaches. However, despite this, concussion rates are rising. So it's pretty clear to see that at some point, the Heads Up program fails to address the root cause of concussions and is not actually effective in reducing the instances of concussion. So I aim to seek why that is. And I would like to mention really quickly that a portion of the increase in concussion rates can actually be attributed to better education and better reporting as a result of the Heads Up program. However, it would be inaccurate to assume that's where the entire increase comes from. There's significant evidence that shows that there are a lot of other factors at play. For example, over the past 40 years, participation in high school sports has increased significantly. Students nowadays are more likely to spend more time at athletic practices and participate in sports where they have more than one practice a day. So there are a lot of factors at play here, and a lot of things to consider when looking at rising concussion rates. So my research question is, in what ways did the Heads Up program fail? And how can we structure a better public health campaign to reduce concussion rates? The first thing I did was look at the Routledge Handbook of Public Communication of Science and Research. It's a really useful handbook which provides a comprehensive view of the most effective methodologies for communicating research publicly, which is exactly what we want to look for. And they even have a chapter titled Health Campaign Research, which is pretty perfect. And so in this chapter, the handbook references a 2001 study that outlines 13 steps to a successful public health campaign. I took those 13 steps, I analyzed them, and I ultimately found that I could condense them down into 3 general criteria that outline a successful public health campaign? First of all, a successful public health campaign must reach a wide audience and generate interest in the audience. Second of all, the campaign must be memorable for those who view it and spark action in those who view it. And finally, the message of the campaign should spread among the public autonomously. With these three criteria, it actually becomes very clear why the Heads Up program ultimately was a failure. First of all, the Heads Up program was targeted towards high school coaches, not the general public. And high school coaches, that's a ridiculously small demographic. And so the general public really had no exposure to this program. Second of all, it's not a very memorable campaign. It just focuses on some mild education, and it really doesn't push people to take action. It just increases awareness of concussion symptoms and yeah, essentially. And finally, because of the past two reasons, there's no message to be spread among the public autonomously. I would actually be very surprised if, most people of the general public have even heard of the Heads Up campaign. I know I hadn't going into my research. I think it's pretty irrelevant to the general public. And so essentially the program fails all three facets of a successful public health campaign. And so that's why it didn't create any real behavioral change. So I wanted to look at a successful public health campaign to see what that looks like in context to the framework that I outlined. And I decided to look at the Real Cost campaign. So in 2014, the FDA established the Real Cost campaign, which is an anti-smoking campaign. And according to the Journal of Preventative Medicine, previous studies with youth found that the Real Cost campaign had high reach among youth and is associated with smoking, is associated with changes in smoking-related attitudes and beliefs, and is associated with reduced smoking initiation. In fact, one study found that between 2014 and 2016, which from a medical standpoint is a very short amount of time, the Real Cost was associated with an estimated 350,000 United States youths age 11 to 18 who did not initiate smoking, who would have had they not been exposed to the campaign. So it's pretty clear to see that the Real Cost campaign sparked real behavior change among its audience. And that's ultimately the goal of any successful public health campaign, is to create a change in the actions of the general public, not just increase awareness of a topic. That's just the first step in the right direction. And so now we can compare it to our framework. So first of all, the Real Cost campaign was a mass media campaign that had a very serious and relevant message. Second of all, it utilized fear reactions to create a strong message and spark behavior change. So research shows that fear reactions, as opposed to utilizing things like humor in a message, actually increase comprehension of the message, increases recall of the message, and causes people more likely to actually take action on the message. And finally, it sparked conversations among the public and extended the reach of the campaign. So there have been studies done that actually cite its ability to reach wider audiences than just teenagers as the source of its effectiveness. Anti-smoking is a very relevant topic to everybody in the general public, and the message was applicable to anyone who even heard about the campaign. And so really the campaign checked all three boxes that we want for a successful public health campaign. And so looking at the Real Cost campaign and our framework for a successful public health campaign, we can start to construct some ideas for a public health campaign focusing on concussions. So first of all, any sort of public health campaign focused on concussions needs to be delivered with sufficient intensity and duration, and it should be delivered as a mass media campaign. Again, public health campaigns need to have a very wide-reaching audience, and there's no reason not to utilize the massive amount of resources with social media and the internet and everything in order to spread the message to very large amounts of people in the general public. Second of all, it should use fear and serious elements to spark behavior change. Like I said before, fear is probably the most efficient and effective way to spark behavior change in an audience. And with the massive amounts of, I would say, worrying and very sobering statistics on concussions and the severe consequences, there's really no shortage of content to include in such a campaign. I think a big issue is that people don't take concussions seriously enough. And so this would actually be the most effective way to change that, is to treat them as very serious issues. And finally, a concussion campaign has to be prescriptionary. In doing so, it will create a conversation among the general public and provide a path to action. So the Heads Up campaign was not prescriptionary at all. It only focused on education, which is a good first step, but it's not going to create behavior change. So ultimately, I think this is really the crux of a public health campaign centered around concussions, is that it really has to advocate for, I believe, reduced participation in risky contact sports, namely football, hockey, lacrosse, and rugby. Those I would say are the four riskiest sports for concussions. And this definitely has some limitations because, first of all, football is a massive industry in the United States. The NFL, has tons of money, and it's probably the most popular sport in America. And so it's going to be definitely difficult to change public perception on that, especially because the health problems with something like smoking are a direct consequence of that action, whereas concussions are an accident. So people are much less likely to associate the consequence with the action, which would be participating in risky sports. But ultimately, there really is not a feasible way, I believe, to significantly reduce concussion rates without reducing participation in these risky sports. There's been better helmet technology, for example, that's been coming out. However, better helmets ultimately, research seems to point to the fact that it really only is successful in reducing skull fracture and not actually successful in reducing concussion rates. And actually, improved padding in helmets, at least in football, allows people to hit each other harder. And in some cases, research indicates that it actually leads to higher concussion rates. So ultimately, I believe that through such a health campaign, uh, involvement in risky activities can be reduced, and it's definitely not going to be easy, and it's absolutely not going to be overnight. But I think in the coming years, with the amount of compelling research that's been done on concussions, public perception over risky activities can be changed, and concussion rates, especially in youth athletes, can absolutely be decreased. Thank you.
Awesome. Great job, Gray. So does anyone have any questions or any thoughts for Gray? We have some applause, some happy faces. It's always good. Awesome. Thanks so much, Gray. You did an excellent job.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, so why don't we take a quick breather? Maybe let's take 2 minutes until 4:34 to stretch, do all the things we need to do, and then we can reconvene afterwards at 4:34. See you guys soon. Okay, let's take about 30, 45 more seconds and we'll get started shortly.
All right, so I hope everyone had a nice little stretch break. And we'll start by introducing our next speaker. It's my pleasure to introduce Ken Collins. Ken Collins has lived with his brain injury for almost 45 years and has worked with people with brain injuries to live independently since 1983. He's an advocate of developing home and community-based services for people with brain injuries. Ken has conducted national webinars on using mindfulness-based therapies, meditation, exercise, and nutrition to assist in the brain injury recovery process. He's also organized Elders First to develop Elder Day services for frail Navajo elders at senior centers on the Navajo Nation. He played a leadership role in the passage of the Vulnerable Adult Protection Act, DORIS Act, on the Navajo Nation. Most recently, Ken was reappointed by New Mexico Governor Michelle Lujan Grisham to the statewide Independent Living Council and is currently the Community Outreach Director at the Hazo Center for Personal Enhancement, where he works with people on the streets of Gallup, New Mexico with brain injuries to stop drinking and improve their quality of life. We're extremely excited to have him here today, and without further ado, I'll hand it off to Ken.
So thank you. Thank you, Dean. It's really an honor to be a part of this conference. And a couple of things. It's Navajo for the pronunciation, and it's the Hojo Center. Hojo is a Navajo word meaning walk in beauty, and I encourage the viewers to Google it. It's to walk in beauty and live in balance and harmony. To me, that's one of the things that after a brain injury, it's hard to do, to balance out our life and live in harmony, not only with ourselves, because there's always a lot of things going on, but it's a real honor, I said, to be here today. By the looks of the people in the crowd, I've been living with my brain injury longer than you've been on the planet. And this journey really started after I had come home from a successful baseball season. My baseball playing has really been what's guided me throughout my recovery. I was drafted in the 10th round in 1970 with the Milwaukee Brewers. And that experience really has helped me after my brain injury. What I called keeping my poise. And if you played athletics, you know poise is really an important thing to do. A lot of it now, come to find out after all these years, and that's why I've been talking about it so much, is mindfulness, mindfulness-based stress reduction. Mindfulness, that's really what's helped me. And really, I'd like to tell you a little bit about my injury. I'd come home from a successful baseball season in Bend, Oregon. I'd taken off that fall, and I was going to play someplace. I wasn't really sure. I had played in the Dominican Republic in 1975, and got to know a lot of Central American players. So after the season in Bend, I was 10-1. Our team had taken the state championship. It was the first time that a team outside of the Portland metropolitan area had won a state championship. And so I decided, well, I've got a history in, I've got a good history in baseball. I was considered a student of the game. So I took off for Central America, Mexico. I had turned down playing in Mexico in '76 because I wanted to stay at home in Oregon to fish and hike and do all the things that I hadn't been able to do in 6 years. And so I made it as far as Southern California, ran out of money, got my van repoed. Me and my dog Jasper hitchhiked back up to Oregon, to my hometown, which is Oak Ridge, about 50 miles outside of Eugene, and wanted to do two things. One was to go to the hot springs. The other was to go snowmobiling. Well, I remember going to the hot springs on New Year's Eve, on Christmas Eve, and they tell me I went snowmobiling. I don't know anything about that. All I know is the end of January 1977, I woke up standing about 6 inches in front of the mirror in my folks' bathroom. I came out of darkness through a fog to about 6 inches in front of the mirror. My mouth was wired shut. I was picking the wires, and I'm thinking, man, what the bleep happened to you? And I knew I was at home. I had my bathrobe on, and I was in my parents' bedroom, back in their bathroom. And I played baseball, and my name was Ken. That's all I knew. I didn't know anything else. I didn't know anything about Ken. I didn't know anything about baseball. I didn't know anything about home. I stood back there for a long time, just looking in the mirror. Hey, what happened to you? Standing back. And so I thought, I'll go ask my mom. And so I went down the hallway, and by coincidence, she's coming down the hall to get ready to go to work. And what happened to me? Why is my mouth wired shut? And she had this look on her face like I had asked her that 10,000 times, which I probably had. And she said, well, you were in a snowmobile wreck up by Summit Lake. And I said, what do you mean? I just got here from California. What happened to me? And I can still feel her hands on my shoulders. Oh, you're back, you're back. Because that was the first time I'd ever been able to say that I had just come back from California. Even though it would take me months and months to ever remember that I was in California. When luckily for me, I had a big box of just stuff that was only important to me. I'm a pack rat in a lot of ways, and especially in the 7th grade when I started putting everything that was important. The first time I went to Farrell's Ice Cream Parlor in Portland with my cousin, relatives, just newspaper articles, love letters, get well cards, everything. It went into the bottom of this drawer in my dresser. As I get older, the drawer gets full, it goes into a box. Then I start putting more and more stuff in the box gets full, I go off and play ball around the country. More stuff gets in that box. So I find myself at 26 years old with this huge box of memories, which was me. Every day, religiously, for hours, I would go through that box. A lot of times I wouldn't remember anything, whatever it was I was looking at. And slowly my memory started coming back, and that gave me hope. And so the first thing I had to do was really prove to myself that if I was going to be okay, was to play baseball again. And so had a chance to, I knew a scout who held these tryouts in Seattle with Seattle Mariners. That was their first year. And so I went up there to try out, and I threw well. And so he invited me to the Kingdome in September of '77 to throw. And I went up and threw well. I threw batting practice to all the prospects that they held. I was hoping to be a prospect, but when you're 26 and trying to break in as close as I got to the big leagues, if I would have been a big leaguer, proven to myself, I would have had a better shot. But I made it as far as AAA, the Sacramento Bees. That's where I was released in '75. But I threw well, and I only had to prove to myself that I could do it. Their prospects, they only hit one ball out of the infield that would have been considered a hit. The rest of the time, they were pop-ups or ground balls. But I proved to myself that I could throw. About that time, there was a sawmill closure in Westford, Oregon. Edward Hines Lumber Company closed down. Laid off my dad, who had worked there for 18 years. And so a group of us workers, what I did to always stay in shape for baseball during the summertime was work in the sawmills, pulling lumber on the green shade, which is real physical. That's how I kept in shape during the wintertime. And I always thought, well, man, there's co-ops. The plywood co-ops in the Northwest, whenever there's a downturn in the wood products industry, the plywood plants are able to stay open. And I like this idea of a co-op, people working together. It's a democratic process. And so I just threw out that idea to the unemployed workers that I knew in Oak Ridge. And before too long, we formed this Westford Workers Association to purchase the mill from Hines. That ended up being my rehab. It gave me a sense of purpose and meaning again, since I could no longer play baseball. But because of my advocacy and my abilities really to organize, I was able to take on a leadership position. But in doing that, I had to write minutes. We got a lot of support from another co-op, a tree planting co-op in Eugene, the Hodads. So there was a lot of technical assistance that I got. And even though I couldn't remember, sometimes back in those days, they called me the tangent man, because I'd go off on a tangent. I'd be talking about one thing and a word would come into my head and that would lead me down another road. And after a few minutes, I'd be to where, what was I just talking about? Well, you were talking about your brain injury and but it didn't matter. Even if I had a video, I couldn't remember. Of course, that hurts when you're trying to organize because of the stigma. It took me a long time. Well, especially those early days, it was really hard because I could tell I was different. And whenever I would try to talk to somebody about that, well, man, I'm different, just to have that, being able to share and really have an understanding, not so much what they were going through, but what I was going through. But it was really hard for them to be able to understand. And you know, one of the things that happens to us after our brain injuries, our friends and later our families are the first to go, friends first, and then family members. That's why it's so critical. What I believe, and what the Hojo is that we're a peer-run organization. I really believe in the power of the peers. We can get so much done, and I'll get to that here in just a second. But so I came home before too long, probably within maybe a month or so. Of course, friends would start, because I don't remember anything. You know, anytime I was in the hospital, my left side was out. My mom told me that I walked with a limp all the time I was in the hospital. I was only in the hospital for, and let me back up here a little bit. When I hit the car, I ran into a car. I broke my jaw below my chin, rammed this jawbone through into my ear canal, broke out some teeth, laid all these teeth back. But on impact, I separated my skull. I had a vascular skull fracture, a cap fracture. And I really think that's probably what saved me, because it allowed the brain swelling to take place and the pressure to be released naturally. You know, as well as the other thing is, when you go through an experience like I did with baseball, I wanted to be a professional baseball player, and I lived that dream. Nothing holds me back. There's nothing that I can't do. And I think that sometimes other survivors get in that role, and because of all the barriers that are out there, dealing with the public, dealing with family members, having people like I just mentioned, trying to understand what you're going through, it's really difficult. And so it's real easy to start getting inside our heads and thinking about the old self, the new self, a lot of preoccupation. It took me a long time to not be preoccupied. Well, especially with me, to try to remember that accident. You know, that took a long time for me to let that go. It was also took me a long time to accept that I had a brain injury, that I was, you know, hurt as bad as I was. But once friends started coming over to see me, one of the early things that I learned, where my baseball playing and keeping my poise came in, was I could recognize their face, but I couldn't remember their name. And the harder I tried to remember their name, and I felt, you know, I mean, I grew up in a small town, so everybody knew me and I knew everyone. But when my friends would come over and I would try so hard to remember their name, I would, this is where my baseball playing came in, because I could feel my muscles tense up. And I knew that that's automatically because of my instincts from pitching to calm, you know, just to relax, just calm down. I'm thinking that in my head, but mostly just slow, deep breaths. And sometimes their name would come. Sometimes I'd remember their name. Not every time, but there was no way I'd remember their name if I kept trying. I learned that from my pitching coach. What he taught me was listening to your body. And why that's important when you're pitching is that the more tense you are, your wrist stiffens up and your fastball straightens out. And even though I could throw 90 miles an hour, having a straight ball makes it easy for hitters to hit. So I learned that early on, and it is instinctive. Still, when I start to get tensed up, I'll automatically kick in my slow breathing, just calm down. And I've got to tell myself that. Anyway, so as time went on, I found myself improving real slow, but it was enough that in 1985, I was a founding member, well, 1983, really, after I got back from the Middle East. In 85, I was a founding member of the Oregon Head Injury Foundation and started holding peer support groups and sharing with other peers, other folks with brain injuries, the idea of keeping your poise. Just calming down. It's going to be okay. Just relax. Just a lot of basic stuff, and so with that, I could start to see people how it improve their lives. They suddenly were going, okay, this is, but I could see that what I was saying about keeping my poise and relaxing helped people. And so I started holding these support groups. I held them in the detention center at Lane County Detention Center. We worked out a thing with detention center that if they they put on their form the question about if you had a concussion, a car wreck, the basic asking those questions. And whenever they found someone who might have had a brain injury, they called us, the Oregon Head Injury Foundation, and I would do peer support with them. So I held a number of peer support groups. I worked a lot with people with brain injuries. My work and then as a VISTA volunteer, I helped to start the first apartment independent living program for people with brain injuries in Eugene, Oregon, called the Yulehorn Apartments. So worked a lot with people with individuals with brain injuries. In 1987, I started noticing that people would just be talking about, family members, friends who had left. The more, then when things started to get emotional, all of a sudden they're getting up and I know that you've seen this with people. And so I was wondering, I wonder if that's the fight or flight response. I didn't know anything about the fight or flight response, except what I had heard when I was a sophomore in high school. And so I was just watching these different, just observing what was going on and thinking about that. I wonder if that's the fight or flight response. And one afternoon, I was driving and listening to our local NPR station, KLCC in Eugene, and there was an interview. Dr. Robert Sapolsky had just completed his baboon study. And it was on the fight or flight response in male baboons and how they were triggered glucocorticoid buildup and different things. But I thought, wow, I wonder if I can talk to him. So I went home, called Stanford. I told her, what this person answered the phone, it must have been a switchboard, and said, hey, my name's Ken Collins. I have brain injury. I was listening to Dr. Sapolsky about his baboon study and fight or flight. And I've been observing in my groups, and I wonder if I could talk to him. And well, I don't know. I shouldn't say that, but next thing you know, ring, ring, hello. And I'm talking to Robert Sapolsky. And so I tell him everything that I've been seeing and my own personal experience and how I handle with that stress when there's too much going on. And he goes, and he sent me the studies, which I later read, but he goes, I've never thought about brain injury, but that makes sense. And what that did to me was really put a spark in me to say, well, if he feels that way, and he's been studying it he studied the baboons, I think, for 18 years. But so I started sharing that with people and about what the fight or flight is. And by 1987, I was nominated to sit on the board of the National Head Injury Foundation, which I was elected, and I served on the Head Injury Foundation from 88 until 95, when I finally decided that I was getting nowhere because I had talked about this, about the fight or flight and stress, and because I was learning more then, but it just really didn't go anywhere. So I got involved with the independent living movement, where peer support plays a critical part. And I felt right in, I felt right at home, because that's really what I've been since all this time, is the independent living, working at independent living centers as peers and working with other people with brain injuries. Here about 7 or 8 years ago, I started holding groups around Gallup here at the detention center, at the treatment centers, the Southwest Conference on Disability in Albuquerque, about stress and how stress triggers our limbic system to take over, and I, since that time, I really have come to accept that I'm blacking out with the word find, that stress is a major problem for us after brain injury, and how the limbic system is a powerful obstacle for our recovery process. The medical model seems to treat the symptoms, but what I found as a peer and an advocate is that we need to educate other people with brain injuries and professionals too, that the power that this limbic system plays and the problems that it creates for us. What I'm seeing on my Facebook page, there's a lot of support groups now, a brain injury survivor support group, support pages. And I shared this with a lot of people with brain injuries, and it seems to be that they believe it. One story I want to leave with you as the power of the limbic system is, it's a story about Russ Francis. He was a tight end with San Francisco 49ers when they went to the Super Bowl. I was interviewed by Russ in Eugene, Oregon. He had a talk show, and it was about brain injury. And so, because Russ has had several, he had one during the Super Bowl. They had to pry the ball. He caught a touchdown. He got his brain injury. He was knocked out for 20 minutes, long time. And they had to pry the football out of his hand. But he said after the game, after the Super Bowl, he doesn't remember any of that. He doesn't remember the Super Bowl or until about 3 months later, when he was back home in San Francisco, and he started getting all these bills, credit card bills from Bimini. And he's Bimini, and he asking his wife. Then he said, "Well, what are all these? What went on in Bimini 3 months ago?" She, "What? You don't remember? We went after the Super Bowl. There were several of us that all flew down. You flew the plane because Russ could fly. He flew the plane to Bimini. They were there for several weeks. And it wasn't until he still doesn't remember being there. See, I think that, and so when he got his bills, he was going, well, I don't know about this. And that's why I'm really interested and finding out, well, more about just the limbic system and how powerful it is, and how stress plays into that with the fight or flight.
Thank you so much, Ken. It was such an inspiring story. And we have room for probably like one question or so. So feel free to just message me in the chat.
Can I say one more thing?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, because one of the things that we're seeing here with the Hojo, and why I say this about the limbic system and fight or flight, is that Gallup has had a major problem here with alcohol abuse. And I believe, after the groups I've held here, that many people here on the streets have brain injuries, which is compounded by historical and intergenerational trauma. Because I really think that in order to solve the problems, we really need to educate people about the power of about how stress affects our daily lives.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, so I have one question here. This is, what do you think is the biggest improvement that can be made in terms of improving support for TBI patients?
Well, independent living centers, peer support is a core service for independent living centers. In your area, there's a World Institute on Disability. They're a fantastic group. But here in New Mexico, we have I'm a certified peer support worker. New Mexico uses peer support as a means, as a foundation to help other people, other peers, other people with substance abuse issues, brain injuries, whatever it is. The power of the peer. It's easy for us to build trust when you're talking to somebody about what you've gone through. There's a bond there, there's a connection there that's made, and that's real powerful. And it also, being a self-advocate, it was good to hear the speaker earlier, Kim, talk about self-advocacy, because oftentimes when we get so locked into our heads, after an injury, it's a lot easier to be in there than it is outside. And so again, I think that peers helping peers. If you look at an example is AA. AA is a peer organization, and the power that individuals have to change their lives and take ownership in whatever issue that is. That's what I think is really important about peers working with each other, is that it is the trust that's built. And it really takes that trust that whoever you're talking to, they know what they're talking about. And they're there to do right by you.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you so much, Ken, for sharing your story. And I definitely agree that trust and having peers around you for support is such a great way to help out. Without further ado, I'm going to pass it off to Julia to introduce our last speaker.
Hi, so I have the pleasure of introducing our last speaker of the night, Amanda Burrill, and she's had a lot of titles throughout her life. She's a veteran, a journalist, she's been a TV host, an endurance athlete, and she's a brain injury survivor. So after she graduated from undergrad at Boston University, she spent 10 years in the Navy with deployments to Iraq and other places around the world. And she worked as a rescue swimmer and as a surface warfare officer. And during her first deployment, she suffered her first traumatic brain injury, but for a long time didn't recognize it as the cause of many health issues that followed. And after her discharge, she was a professional endurance athlete. She's competed in over 20 marathons, I believe, and done Ironmans. And she also completed a master's degree in journalism from Columbia University and earned a culinary arts degree as well. And after that, began her career as a travel and culinary journalist. So she's worked for the LA Times and the New York Post and traveled across the world. So as you can tell, she's led a really interesting life, but I think you'll see from her talk that the most impressive part is how she's dealt with her brain injuries. She's had at least 19 surgeries, I believe, and seen over 300 doctors. And during her journey, she's become a strong self-advocate for her own care, as well as a passionate advocate for better brain injury care for others. And she's actually in the process right now of recovering from a recent 13-month stretch where she got multiple concussions. So we're really grateful that she's taking some of her time right now to speak with us. And yeah, I'd like to welcome her to start.
Thanks, Julia. You make me sound way cooler than I am. Actually, you know, my resume is interesting, and I owe pretty much everything on my resume to brain injury, because I would be a lawyer right now if it weren't for what happened to me on my first deployment, which just changed the trajectory of my life and how I was able to function, and I just had to adapt. So I didn't really understand that I'd had a traumatic brain injury until years later when I had another one. And it became evident, you know, with some of the issues I had that, wait, my vision, my balance, my speech is all messed up. This was what happened to me before. And the pieces got put together over time. And then my medical record had been digitized by then from 2003. That was my first deployment. And it all like, oh, I had been unconscious at some point. I had been knocked out like for at least 2 hours. Like, so, but essentially, I'm not saying that it's a good thing that I had these, but it really, it forced me to become the best version of myself. So I can speak to several things, and I know this was supposed to be a policy day, and I have been involved in advocacy down in Washington, D.C., and trying to dictate policy, contributing to the Deborah Sampson Act and stuff like that. But as Julie mentioned, in the past, well, not the past, the last one was in November, I had a 13-month stretch where unfortunately, 2 of them were fainting, but I fell and hit my head again. And I had been through acute care already. And it was just, I had to take some time for myself and say enough is enough and figure out why this was happening and get to the bottom of a lot of things, which I've been doing. And right now I'm in Idaho. I live in New York City, but I traded my place for a place out here in the woods to take care of myself for the season. But I thought I would probably just give a little background on my story, talk a bit about handling the VA. Not all VAs are created equal, and VAs are doing a lot better than they used to do, but it's still not, it's still a work in progress, and almost none of my care has been through the VA. And talk about some of the loopholes I fell through along the way, whether they be because of coming across fine, you look fine, or just my own stubbornness and not knowing how to ask for help. Lastly, open up for questions, because this might cause some questions, and I like to answer questions. And I was a late addition to this. I'm glad Julia found me, and we connected, because this is something I can show up and talk about. I don't have to prepare too much, because this has been my life. But so essentially, I was raised by a military father, and in very much a way where there was no complaining, there was no, you're not supposed to be emotional or anything like that. And the military really reinforced that. So when I was injured, even though I didn't understand what the injury has been, this was my first deployment. This was before I became a rescue swimmer. I was an officer on a ship, and our ship had been converted to a prison. It was 2003. The war had just started, and they needed a place to bring prisoners because we didn't have an established prison in country yet. I was just, every night I was the junior officer on board, so I always get stuck with the really unfortunate watch from midnight to 4 a.m, and I'd stand the same watch every night. And we just know that at Reveille one day at 6 a.m, I was found. I was just at the bottom of a hatch with a vertical ladder, and I was just at the bottom, and I was passed out and or sleeping. It wasn't, we weren't like outraging or anything like that. But the way I interpreted what had happened to me was that my neck really hurt. And what shows up in my medical record is talking about how bad my neck hurts, and talking about a weird feeling that I had to breathe consciously. Like I couldn't, like something was going on where I wasn't breathing normally on my own. And then it goes into these complaints about not being able to catch a Frisbee or read, having to cut and paste my briefs rather than digest information and then be able to write the briefs from scratch. Now, given what we know now, it was clear that I'd hit my head really hard and that I was suffering some symptoms because of it. Digestion became a really big issue for me for several years after that, actually. And so we got back from deployment, and what we see in my record, because I don't really remember much of this at all, is that there are 7 times that I complain that I'm crashing my bike. And I was already, I was a college athlete. I was an athlete my whole life. Like the fact that I was crashing my bike was devastating to me, just like not catching a Frisbee. It's like, who am I? And even more than that, there were the telltale emotional issues. Again, though, back then, mid 2000s, that was not a time to be talking about having emotional issues. This was a time when you are still, like they were giving people other than honorable discharges for mental health issues. So it's much different now, thankfully. But it never even occurred to me. That I had these issues, or I couldn't admit it to myself, much less to anyone else. So I wasn't helping matters much either. But what often happens, I find, especially with veterans, may be that they'll report physical symptoms, but not emotional ones, because that's seen as weakness. And that was the case with me. I was in gastroenterology for years. I was a 24-year-old having colonoscopies, and being such an avid athlete, I think helped because I wanted to be performing, and athleticism turned into, there's one thing Julia didn't mention. I am an avid mountaineer as well. And that was a thing that I started several years ago. And just like you need to be healthy, and exercise is an outlet, and it was for me. And the digestion thing was really interfering with my sports game, because at that point, I had gotten a divorce. I had no understanding of why I didn't want to be around people. People talking to me was very aggravating, and I didn't get it. So what I did was I crafted a life where I got up and I worked out, and then I went to work, and then at lunch I worked out, and then I worked more, and then at night I worked out, and then I ate, and then I went to bed. And that was my life for 4 or 5 years. And if somebody wanted to hang out, I would usually go out and meet them late, like hopefully everyone's already been drinking and they won't notice that I can hardly hold a conversation. And I just lived like that for a long time. And I think that that adaptation was in some ways traumatizing, because I didn't feel like myself and I felt a loss of identity. I'd always identified as both an athlete and a scholar. And then suddenly I felt like I was hardly either of those. And that's how I became a rescue swimmer. Like I said, everything in my resume, I found that I was quite capable in the water. I'd always been a swimmer and I was a triathlete, but I thought, why not try and flex what few capabilities I still have by doing this? And at the time, there weren't women rescue swimmers, and it wasn't a job for officers, but I asked. I got denied 6 times, and finally I got to go, and I became a rescue swimmer, and that gave me a really big sense of identity. And it also took the pressure off me being so bad at other things being mostly anything that had to do with reading or like working on a laptop, spreadsheets, stuff like that. I just didn't get that this could be related to head injury. And at the time, I remember hoping and praying that I would get diagnosed with some sort of disease, because at least then I would have an answer. Because all I really had to go on was that GI kept coming back normal, and I just didn't have much information. So when I left the military, I couldn't go to law school as planned. I had taken the LSATs, and obviously with a military career, got into a bunch of good schools, even though I would assume that my essays might not have been that great. I had, a military career that spanned like wartime, and I had good grades and good scores from my undergrad at Boston University. And I just couldn't go to law. I knew I couldn't go. I couldn't read. It was weird. I could write, I could talk, but going back to edit anything I wrote and going reading, and I just knew my ex-husband had been a lawyer, and he was like, I don't know, it's like, if you can't read, don't go to law school. And that was the first time I just didn't even try something in my life. And what ended up happening was I felt like, and this mirrors much of my adult life, I had to find what I call like the Venn diagram, or I had to do an assessment. What can I do? What do I actually feel like doing? Where do they overlap? And then I choose something in there. And that's how I ended up in culinary school in Los Angeles. And I went to Le Cordon Bleu and studied French cuisine. And it was just chasing down things that interested me, in light of not understanding why I couldn't do the one thing I thought I should be doing with my life, which was the way I saw it at the time, smart people things. Smart people things involve reading books and more education and changing the world. And so, that was my second choice. And that's how I ended up in culinary school. And then I worked at the LA Times in the food section, where I was there as a chef. But I just had this inherent knowledge that I had lived this life of travel and adventure, and you guys should let me write. Like, I've been a lot of places, and so they let me write. And then I wanted to write about travel, and they're like, well, you can't just cross over to the travel section. I was like, well, that's what I want. So I'm going to go to journalism school and get my master's. And that's how I ended up at journalism school. Is I decided I wanted to travel and write about it. Little did I know at the time, you don't need a master's to write about journalism. And then I go to journalism school, and I still can't read books, but I'm able to make it work. And I took courses like ethics and food writing, and got into things where research wasn't as important as having an opinion and I got into lifestyle writing, where I could interview people and I could write about it, but if I had to do a lot of research and analysis, it was just kind of not going to happen. And that's how I ended up doing a lot of the things that I ended up doing. And whenever I had a great job, I got this amazing job at the New York Post in the sports section. I was the first woman to ever work there. And I just knew that I wasn't performing very well, and I didn't understand why. It was something with my eyes and screens, but I left the job. And I said, I'm going to move to France, and I'm going to study wine, because if I'm going to quit, I have to go do something that's really big, and I can't just sit home and eat bonbons. But that was just how I adapted from thing to thing. So it wasn't until later that I fell down a flight of stairs and smashed my head in a way that was very obviously a head injury, blew out my retina, ended up having spine surgery, tore my jaw. I was an outpatient for about a year. This was late 2015 through through 2017. I was outpatient the whole time, but that was my whole gig, was going to speech, going to vision. I did all this acute care, and it was like, whoa, like my bandwidth opened so much, and I was not there yet, but it made me realize that what I'd been dealing with for so long was related to head injury. Of course, over time, it becomes a confluence of physical injury and mental health. But and it was after that that I felt like I'd been given a new chance at life, and but things still weren't right. And I was always vocal about that. I didn't get much care at the VA hospital because my neuropsych testing kept coming back almost across the board very good. There were these 5 areas where I performed absolutely horribly, and then the rest was like, 99th percentile type stuff. And so I wasn't getting any help, and they didn't even do like a physical exam on me, even after that big injury with the blown retina. Like no vision, none of that. And I ended up over at NYU for all my acute care, which was very helpful. But this pressure from the way I had lived my life was to always come across like everything's fine. It was pretty much the most important thing. Get to tomorrow, make it look good. And I don't think about that anymore. That's the way I used to. But long story short is I got into mountaineering because I had all this neuropathy and I was having a lot of trouble running, and we didn't really understand what the neuropathy was from. And I realized when I was outside in the cold that I felt a lot better. And I had no idea back then about like vagus nerve stuff and sympathetic, parasympathetic, or any of that. But I found that being in cold weather was calming to me. And that's how I started with this whole mountaineering thing. And that's how I discovered being properly hydrated, and how being properly hydrated really changed the game in my cognition. And I was always well hydrated. I'm an athlete. I know how to hydrate, but overhydrating and then using electrolytes. And I started tracking my vital signs for 3 straight months, every single thing. And I started doing my own like analysis. And I discovered that I probably had this thing called POTS. And then I went to a bunch of different hospitals, and they did all this autonomic testing on me. And, they told me that I did have this orthostatic issue, and that I had like vasovagal failure and like baroreflex, this or that. And that my whole autonomic system was completely rocked. And people in my life had thought I was just crazy because I would get out a notebook and like write down my blood pressure, and I would do all this stuff all day long. I mean, I would do it again because it got me here. And so it was after I figured out like this whole idea of post-concussion syndrome that, or whatever they're calling it these days, persistent concussive symptoms, it seems to always change. Whatever it is, it's like, I don't care what the label is. I care what the fix is. And I started finding a little more help. And then I found that in this realm, when we start getting into functional neurology and a little more of the higher level stuff past acute care, I mean, it can get very expensive, to find help. But, thankfully I was willing to like spend whatever I had left. And I was working quite diligently on a lot of these things when, I just had a stretch of bad luck. And I was in an accident. And then I had the 2 times that I fainted after that accident, and I had the 3 more concussions. But having been through stuff before, and I'm not like, no head injury is to be taken lightly, but having been through like head injury and not understand what I was going through, and then to go through acute rehab and then to have some more head injuries, it was almost like, okay, this is almost smooth sailing because at least I know what I'm dealing with right now. And that's when I decided to give up this whole like not talking about it thing, because talking about it is how other people might realize what's going on with them. And I've been really vocal, especially in support of fellow veterans, because what I realized was that a lot of people had, much like me, I didn't even mention, I spent 3 years skydiving a lot when I worked over at EOD, Explosive Ordnance Disposal. And if you think about EOD, this is like the community that like kind of blew up, no pun intended, the idea of head injury and blast injury. That was the community I was working in after I was a rescue swimmer for 3 years. And then I worked at EOD for the rest of the time. And I still didn't understand what, like, I still never correlated it to me. But having so many people in my life that I know personally who had been on 4, 5, 6 Middle East deployments and gone through like many, like not just accidents in convoys, but blast exposures, or been near missiles that were firing it, and trying to get people to understand you don't have to even remember that this happened. If you have issues, always try to get to the root cause of your issue, and solve the problem, not mask the problem. And another part of my story was that when I left the military, they very not really acknowledging any of my problems while I was in the military, but when I left, it was very much a okay, well, clearly you're depressed, you have PTSD, you have attention issues, and you have fibromyalgia, all of these things. And I was willing to listen. I was willing to hear that out. But the solution for all of these things was medication. And I have like, I'm working on a project where I'm putting all of this together. I'm more concerned about making sure my health is in great working order first. Like, this story ain't going anywhere is how I see it. But I have seen over 300 doctors, and I was prescribed over 56 medications, 13 of which were psychiatric. And, you know, there was a lot of stuff going on with antibiotics and GI stuff. So 56 sounds like a lot, but a lot of those were pain meds. And then, you know, with the head injury stuff, my thyroid was acting really weird. And it's just that none of it was ever seen as an integrative issue. It was like, okay, you can't digest and your hair is falling out and this and that. When, you know, in the long run, it really all did. I went on that deployment very healthy, very happy, feeling very safe in the world, and sure of myself. And things changed after that. So I'm happy to say that things are great right now. Even though I'm still working on some of my post-concussive issues, and I'm working on some visual processing stuff. Earlier today, I was just sitting here doing my brain exercises, but I don't see it. I see it as, you know, it's just part of my story right now and who I am. And the sooner I get this, I get through this, the sooner I can move on with my life. But I don't see it as, you know, there's only the future. I'm much better now at appreciating right now. And it took a long time for me to process what had happened and see it logically, and something I can smile about and joke about instead of get angry and want to flip the table, because that was the case for a really long time. As far as policy goes, I could go on forever. Good at talking, not at reading. I was a part of a group called High Ground Veterans Advocacy, and I really wanted to be a part of it even in the 2 years before I was, but I wasn't there yet with like getting together like sentences and stuff. And it was really wonderful because I went down to Washington, D.C., and I learned the advocacy process. Of how, because I didn't want to do as much like rah, get on Twitter. I wanted to do like, I'm going in and I'm sitting in front of somebody who dictates policy or who contributes to policy. And I'm going to tell you what happened. And I'm going to tell you the loopholes in the VA system where I wasn't given help in a timely manner, or wasn't acknowledged, or the idea that as a woman, I was immediately diagnosed as having mental health issues. And you know, or maybe it's because I was a woman that happened. Is this happening at a higher incidence for women, stuff like that. And it was really eye-opening to figure out the process and just learn how to contact these offices and understand like who's the person I'm talking to in there and who's on what committee and stuff like that. And it's all very valuable stuff. I remember all of it. It was just unfortunate that I rolled into an accident just a couple months after I did that. But I have a feeling that I'm not going anywhere in the brain injury and concussion. And I don't even get into the all these labels with dysautonomia and stuff like that. People get injured, people have problems, and everyone deserves to feel better, and everyone deserves to get back to their baseline. And some people start with a high baseline that was held against me a lot, that you're doing well enough. But I remember what it's like to think clearly, and I remember what it's like to read a book. And I'm working with the Mind Eye Institute in Chicago right now, and also a couple places, a naturopathic doctor just to double check other things, and Cognitive FX in Provo, Utah, just doing some pretty simple integrative brain training. And I have felt just in the last 6 months that I've been working on this, I have felt the differences in ways that I always knew. It was like, this is how I put it. I always just had to hope that there was a light at the end of the tunnel. And now I see it, and it's very bright. And being able to go back to sports and, alpine ski like an athlete, not in survival mode, not fearful of falling and hitting my head, and just feeling like, I think I said this yesterday, maybe when Julie and I touched base, it's almost like getting tapped on the shoulder, and it's me like coming back. And that was something worth fighting a really long time for. And yeah, I think that's basically my story. And I'm happy to answer any questions if anyone has questions. I probably talked longer than I was allowed to.
No, you're totally good. So I do have a question for you. You talked about how, it took so long for you to actually get diagnosed correctly with like having a brain injury, and that being like the underlying cause of a lot of health issues. And you were given like a lot of medications that weren't appropriate and that sort of thing. And do you feel like that's because of some sort of disconnect where like doctors didn't have enough time, or like weren't paying attention enough and trying to figure out the full picture of all of your symptoms? Or do you feel like doctors themselves just like weren't aware enough about brain injuries and just like saw that you were a veteran and were like, oh, you have PTSD, you have this?
Yeah, I mean, upon leaving the military, I think a lot of it came back to the fact that, one, I didn't remember the fact that I had been knocked unconscious. That part of it wasn't in my mind. And so if I had been asked that, I would have said no. And I had even drowned once as a rescue swimmer. Thankfully, I was resuscitated. But like, I didn't even register that as, like now I know that to be a hypoxic event. My lack of knowledge didn't help things very much, but I would say once I was in the system, the real problem for me was that the stressor was never removed. And the stressor for me was not being able to perform and not being able to drive without feeling like I was going to crash, not being able to read books. So there was even though I was being traumatized by what happened. I wouldn't say I was classically depressed. Like I was always getting up early and I had motivation, but there was a situational depression going on about my like, what was my life? Who am I without my faculties? That the more I went without addressing the real cause, the initial cause of my issues, the more it did turn into a mental health thing. And that's something that was easily given medication. And then when medication didn't help, I would get more, I don't like to use the word aggressive. I was very assertive. And my assertion would a lot of times lead to, okay, like this woman is not going to stop coming here and demanding help, and then like switching medications or trying this, and then suddenly doing all these nerve blocks and stuff. And at the end of the day, that's why I try to tell people, like, if you don't remove the stressor, you can't come out of this trauma state. And that's how I came to live in this survival mode for a really long time. That made me really good at having fun and jumping out of airplanes and racing and going out for 3 or 4 weeks at a pop to freaking climb Denali or something like that, but very bad at actually conceptualizing what the future looks like, or making a plan for it, because that hadn't been a way that I thought or lived, and my nervous system certainly hadn't lived like that. That's why I really stress like getting to your root cause. And I do think, I do feel that a lot of my a lot of it came down to volume. You know, at the VA hospital in New York City, they see a lot of people, and it's like you get a 20-minute appointment, and they're usually running an hour behind anyway. And like, there's not the time for someone to help you pick apart your story. When I got over to NYU in the private sector, I got a lot more attention. That's just what it came down to. And it shouldn't have to be like that for anybody. I don't care if you're a veteran or if you're an athlete or if you're a victim of domestic violence. Everybody deserves to have their full story heard and understood. I ended up over at NYU even with, you know, I have an MS doctor. Like, I don't have MS, but I had all this neuropathy, both autonomic and peripheral. It was just like trying to piece it all together. And, you know, sometimes like I do kind of joke, it's not a joke at all, that I'm still my own quarterback. I'm my own primary care doctor, but I'm a decent one, maybe second string, but I'm doing okay.
Okay, so we need to wrap up in a minute or two, but I have another question from the audience for you. So Jason thanks you for your service and asks, did your marriage fall apart because of issues stemming from a brain injury?
Oh yeah. So this is like the one, this thing keeps moving. This is the one thing that, like, I really didn't understand on this deployment. I didn't want to come back. I didn't want to go back to San Diego. Who wants to stay in the Middle East and not go back to San Diego? Because I didn't understand why I didn't have any more emotion. I had anger, but I didn't have any more emotion. And so what happened was, when I came back from this deployment, I told my husband, I was like, I don't know what happened to me. I was very honest. I don't know what happened to me, but I used to have feelings and now I don't. And it was amicable. Like it stunk, but it took me years to start feeling emotionally capable again. And it was just a nasty byproduct of all of this that happened. And years later, after that second brain injury and trying, like, unraveling a lot of this, I contacted him and let him know that I had figured it out. And what he said was, I assumed because you went on this 7-month deployment to the Middle East that something really bad happened, and that you didn't want to tell me what it was, but it changed you. And and like, I wasn't going to pry because you were so adamant about wanting the divorce. And that is what happened. Something changed me. And thankfully, the brain is plastic, and over time I changed back.
Thank you so much for sharing. I know that that's like a lot of personal experiences, and like it's been really great to hear your whole story yesterday and today. It's been awesome to connect with you. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks
And
for having me.
yes, of course, it's an honor. And we're gonna pass it off to the call now to give some closing remarks for the day.
Yeah, I want to reiterate thank you to our speakers. We really enjoyed hearing from y'all today and having you here. Thank you for joining us on this Friday. I'm going to speak a little bit about tomorrow. So in the last leg of our conference, we're going to look a bit more to the future with some really exciting people who are going to talk about, you know, the future of innovation in recognizing and treating traumatic brain injuries. So we're going to begin our day at 3:30 Pacific time with Dr. Robert Hamilton, who's an accomplished entrepreneur and engineer. He's also a clinical researcher and currently an executive at Nova Signal, which is a company that's revolutionizing how we can use real-time blood flow data to recognize problems in brain health. And then we're going to have a panel with several patients, brain injury survivors, who will speak about a little bit of their experiences with TBI and a little bit about the community support group here at Synapse. And to finish the day, our last speaker will be Professor Pratik Mukherjee, who's a clinical neuroscientist and an attending neuroradiologist at the University of California, San Francisco. And he studies the cutting edge of TBI imaging in the modern day. So it'll be a really exciting concluding day. Quick reminder to fill out the attendance form if you haven't yet. We do want to get you your DoorDash credit next week. And that concludes our events for today. So thank you for coming. Stick around if you have any questions. And thank you again to all our awesome speakers.